A legend has been brought back to life. This is a Yezdi, one of 3 Yezdis that have been recently launched in India. Now, if you know your motorcycling history, you'll know all about Java, how that led to Yezdi, before Yezdi shut shop in the late 1990s. But Classic Legends, which is partially owned by Mahindra, has brought Yezdi, just like it did to Java, back to life. Now, this is the Scrambler. There are 2 other Yezdis on sale right now. There's the Roadster and the Adventure, and all of them, they share an engine. It's the same engine out of the Perak with a few changes, but they're in all different states of tune, and they share different chassis components because these are different motorcycles. This is a Scrambler, the Roadster is a road bias bike, the Adventure, well, it's a proper ADV, so they all share different components and they are different motorcycles. Before we get into what they're like to ride, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the Evo India channel and leave a comment down below. What do you think of the Yezdis? Before we get into what this motorcycle is like to ride, let's quickly talk about the specs on this bike. Firstly, it gets a double cradle frame. Now, all 3 motorcycles here get double cradle frames, but Classic Legends is saying that all 3 frames are different and unique to each motorcycle. Apart from that, you've got this engine, which is straight off the Perak, which has a few changes to it to make it a little better. So there are updates to the crankshaft, to the camshaft, to the valve train, to the cylinder head. There's a lot that's been done here to make this engine behave a little differently and to improve NVH. Now, this exhaust has a single port design, but there are twin exhausts over here. So it splits somewhere down here and goes into 2 exhaust pipes. But apart from that, these bikes are pretty similar. Another thing that stands out about these bikes is they have different swing arms, because the Scrambler and the Roadster get twin shocks at the back, whereas the Adventure, it gets a monoshock. So in that sense, they differ. But let's talk about the Scrambler specifically and what makes it a Scrambler. Well, the styling cues are obvious, right? You've got this round headlamp up front, you've got this little bit of a cowl over here, the beak. I think that's the most distinctive design element that gives away that it's a Scrambler. You've also got spoked wheels, you've got, with the spoked wheels, obviously, tube tires. Now, these tires are essentially MRF curved tires. They've got an off-roadish block pattern, but they are more an on-road tire than an off-road tire. Apart from that, you've got this nice upright handlebar with this brace in the middle. You've got these knuckle protectors over here. They feel really solid. They're not just flimsy plastic, but they do have some proper bracing over here. You don't have adjustable levers or anything like that, but you do get a USB charger on the handlebar of the Scrambler. You also get a digital instrument cluster. Now, this is common across all 3 variants, though the Adventure does things a little differently. We'll come to that when we're riding the bike. It also gets this tuck and roll seat, very typical of these retro motorcycles, and you've got a little bit of a tray over here at the back. That's essentially what makes this stand out as a Scrambler in terms of its styling. It looks like a Scrambler, it looks like a fun little motorcycle that will be useful on the road as well as off the road, and we've ridden it both on the road and off the road. Now, let's start with the engine. What does it feel like? It's a nice punchy engine. Now this is the lightest bike here. It weighs 182 kgs, and for that weight, this engine actually makes a nice amount of shove. Now, the Scrambler engine is tuned a little differently. It's designed to have a flatter torque curve, so at lower revs, it has slightly higher torque than the other bikes over here, but it doesn't peak as high. So at higher revs, it's not as high peaking. In terms of peak outputs, it makes 29.1 bhp and 28.2 bhp, and that's actually the lowest amongst this lot here, but it gets a move on fairly quickly. At lower revs, it does have a certain amount of grunt. It's not super punchy, but it does get a move on. It's pretty tractable and you can potter about in a high gear on this bike without trouble. Where it really comes alive is after 6,000 RPM. 6,000 to 8,000 RPM, it really comes alive and it really gets a move on. And it feels really nice and happy when you're keeping it spinning high up in those revs. In terms of NVH, there are some vibrations. Actually, the handlebar is very vibe-free. I was very surprised by that. You don't feel any vibes on the handlebar, but when you look lower down at your pegs on the tank, you do feel some amount of vibrations creeping into the seat, creeping into the tank and into the pegs, which is a bit of a duller. Now, all these bikes come with 6-speed gearboxes, and I must say they're very slick units. They're easy to slot into gears. You can clutchless upshift without trouble. The clutch itself is very light. It does get a slipper clutch, and getting up to speed on this bike is not a task at all. It's very enjoyable, in fact. Now, coming to the ride and handling setup on this bike, something that I found about the Scrambler is it is a little stiff. Over really bumpy roads, you will get shaken a little bit. The front suspension, the rear suspension, both of them are tuned to be a little stiff, and that might be a downer if you're planning to ride this over really bad roads. If you're standing up and riding, you don't feel it so much because a lot of it is absorbed by your knees, but when you're sitting on the seat, you do feel it. That aside, the handling is really nice. It feels very predictable, very confident. You can tip it into corners nicely and it holds its line well. At no point does it feel like it's going to wash out on you. At no point does it feel like it's wavering. The stiff suspension does help in that regard, and dynamically it does feel like a very sound motorcycle. We've ridden it a bit off-road as well, and off-road it's actually not too bad. I was a little scared that the stiff suspension would hamper it a little bit off-road, but once it's on a trail and you get on the gas, it's a lot of fun. It deals with these really rough patches confidently. Stand up on the bike, gas it out, no stress at all. You've got off-road ABS mode, so you can turn off the rear ABS and get the rear out if you like. The ground clearance is really good. I think it's got 200 mm of ground clearance, and that means riding on these off-road trails, even if there are rocks, even if there are bumps, no stress at all. This thing will take it all, and it's actually good fun to ride. The ergonomics are really nice as well. Let me get onto the bike and show you. So once you're on the bike, I can sit down here with my feet flat, no problems at all. And once I get my feet up, it's spacious, it's roomy, and this upright handlebar is also very nicely positioned. I'm 5'10" and I find this to be a really comfortable riding position. Even standing up on the motorcycle, these little grooves over here make it very easy to stand up and ride. So ergonomically, I think the Yezdi Scrambler is very sound. It does a good job in that regard. And honestly, it's a very well-rounded motorcycle. The ride quality, yes, it is stiff, but apart from that, I really enjoyed riding this bike. Now let's talk about the Adventure. This is the most expensive motorcycle of this lot, and it's essentially a full-blown ADV. I know what you're thinking. It looks very similar to the Himalayan, and in all fairness, even in the flesh, it does. But come up close and there are little details that make it stand apart. Now let's talk about the spec first. In terms of the fact that it's an ADV, you get all the proper components on it. So you've got a 21-inch front wheel. You've got long travel suspension in the front and the rear. The ground clearance is more as well. You've got 220 mm of ground clearance here. The tires on the motorcycle, Siat Grip XLs, these are the same tires that you get on the Himalayan. And apart from that, you've got these tall upright bars, you've got this split seat design. The seat is actually scooped out to make it a little more comfortable for shorter riders. You've got an upswept exhaust over here, and you get this massive luggage rack at the side. Coming to the engine, it's got the same engine as the other three, but it makes different amounts of power and torque. The peak power and peak torque is different. Here, it makes 30.2 bhp and 29.9 Nm of torque. That makes it the most powerful of the lot. And honestly, it needs that power because it's also the most heavy of the lot. It's 188 kgs. Now, what does it feel like to ride? Well, out on the road, it's as you would expect an ADV to be. It soaks up bumps reasonably well. It's slightly on the firmer side. I think it's firmer than a Himalayan, but it still soaks up roads pretty well. The engine, like the other ones, it makes most of its power in the mid-range to top end. So it's not the most tractable. You can do fifth gear 40 kilometers an hour just about, but anything less than that, it starts clattering very badly and doesn't quite enjoy it. So you have to keep the revs slightly high. On-road dynamics, well, the steering is a little bit heavy, so getting it tipped into the corner isn't as easy as on the Scrambler. The Scrambler felt much more nimble, and it probably did because it has a much sharper rake angle. This is a little more relaxed, and it leads to a little slower steering feel. As for riding it off-road, well, the suspension obviously does its bit. It soaks up bumps reasonably well. I felt when there are a few bigger ruts and bigger bumps. It passed on more than I would have liked up to the rider. It felt a little unsettled on certain patches, and I didn't feel fully confident at the front end most of the time. I don't know why that is. Because these tires, they're good. We've used them on the Himalayan. They give you plenty of confidence there. But somehow I felt a little bit nervous on this motorcycle. That aside, the ground clearance, it's there. The engine, as long as you're keeping it revved up and you don't stall it, it's there. And you've got to tune your riding style for the motorcycle a little bit. You've got to keep it revving. You've got to make sure you're in the right gear. And once you do that, it's a breeze to ride off-road. It tackles bumps, trails, climbs, whatever you throw at it very comfortably. You do need to manage its weight. It is lighter than the Himalayan, but it's still a heavy motorcycle at 188 kgs. So you do need to manage its weight. It's not flickable and you can't chuck it around like you would in X-Pulse. But that aside, it is a competent motorcycle off-road. Other features that I have missed, again, this gets switchable ABS, so you can turn off the ABS from here. And another cool feature that it gets is turn-by-turn navigation. So you can download the Yezdi app on your phone, hook it up to this. It's powered by the Kogo app. And once you do that, you can get turn-by-turn navigation straight on your dashboard. The dashboard itself is interesting. It can tilt by 15 degrees. So you've got two knobs here and you can loosen them up and tilt the screen up by 15 degrees and tighten it up again. You can't do this when you're on the go. It's not something you can just reach out and do. You need to stop, use both your hands, get it tilted and then put it back. But otherwise, I think it's a neat little touch. The windscreen itself doesn't move. It's a fixed windscreen. As for the price, this is priced at rupees 2.1 lakh rupees. So it's a little more expensive than the Scrambler, but you are getting a lot more in terms of components and features. Its most obvious rival is the Himalayan, and over the years the Himalayan has improved considerably, and today the BS6 Himalayan is quite a machine. How does this fare against the Himalayan? I don't think it's quite there yet, but I'm looking forward to putting it to a proper comparison test to find out. Now let's talk about the Yezdi Roadster. This is the most affordable of all of the three, and it's also the only pure road-biased motorcycle for all of the three. You look at the cues that it's telling you. You've got a 17-inch front wheel, alloy wheel with tubeless tires. You've got suspension that isn't long travel, it's just regular suspension. You've got this neat looking tank over here. Again, the same engine, but there's one difference with this engine. It gets twin port exhausts, which lead into two separate exhaust pipes. You've got a nice wide seat, a low seat height, very easy to get onto, easy to get off. And you've got a passenger seat with a small backrest over there. You've also got these cool looking bar end mirrors, though, I'll tell you what, I'm not too big a fan of them because I found out that when you're taking a U-turn, they sort of impede in where your arm should be. They sort of pinch you slightly over here and it limits your maneuverability, which I'm not too big a fan of. If they were underneath the handlebar, it would have been much easier. So I don't think it should be too hard a task to swap these around and face them the other way. That aside, it's got this tiny headlamp, this raked out front end, and it looks like a cool roadster. Now what's it like to ride? I really like the engine in this package. This, like the other engines, makes a lot of its power high up, and it really feels that way. It's a little high strung. It doesn't like to be kept too low in the rev range. It starts clattering, but you ride it really energetically. You keep it high up in the revs on the road and it really rewards you. It has good performance and it really complements the chassis of the motorcycle. Now, NVH, not exactly its strength. Again, the vibrations are really well insulated at the bar, but at the foot peg and at the seat, at the tank, you can feel a fair few of these vibrations, especially at higher revs. Coming to the way this motorcycle handles and rides, well, again, ride quality is a little stiff. It feels a little more compliant than the Scrambler, and it actually does well on our roads. But that said, the handling is very nice. It's not got a really sharp front end. It's got a slightly lazy front end. You've got to lean it in nicely. You've got to be confident with your steering action. But once you do that, it leans over and it really corners well. It holds its line well, it's stable, and at no point does it feel like it's going to be nervous or anything of the sort. On a fast winding road, if you are using the most of the engine, just ring it out, have fun with it. Lean in with the chassis and you'll have a whale of a time. I do have one criticism of the brakes. I just felt they were a little spongy. The stopping power is actually good. So you stand on the front brake and the rear brake together, it does come to a halt very quickly. But I just didn't like the feel at the front. It felt a little bit, it lacked a little bit of feel. That said, the Roadster, a bona fide road bike, and it'll do very well on the road. It's an alternative, obviously, to the Java and to the 42. In terms of ergonomics, it's slightly different. In terms of the way it handles, it's slightly different. In terms of the way it makes its power also, it's slightly different. And it's different in its own unique way. It feels a little more brutish, like you've got to muscle it around a little bit, like you've got to really know what you're doing to enjoy it. But if you do that, you really have a good time on the Yezdi. I want to show you the ergonomics of the motorcycle as well. So, like I said, very low seat height. I can get both feet on the ground comfortably. Even when I'm sitting, I can stand up over it. It's really comfortable. The bars are a stretch, but they're not out of reach. So I'm in a comfortable position, and the foot peg position, it's not exactly set forward. It's set slightly rearward. So it's almost under my thigh. Not quite under my thigh, but almost under my thigh. And this is interesting because this doesn't mean it's a straightforward cruiser, but it does feel like a little aggressive motorcycle. It feels something like the Street Rod from Harley Davidson. It's quite an interesting seating position, and yeah, it makes for an engaging ride. That aside, the Yezdi Roadster is obviously an alternative to the Java and the Java 42. And in that sense, it has a slightly different character. The ergonomics are different, the engine is tuned slightly differently, the chassis is tuned slightly differently. And to that end, it feels like a motorcycle that you can be a little more naughty with. It's something that you need to really muscle around. It's something that you can have a lot of fun with. And it has its own personality, that's for sure. So what do I make of these Yezdi motorcycles? Well, there's one for every kind of rider. You've got this Roadster for somebody who wants to stick to the roads completely. My favorite was the Scrambler. I think it has the most character. I think it lets you do the most with it, whether it's on-road, off-road, light off-road trails. It can take on some serious stuff. And I also like the way it made its power, that high torque, actually flat torque curve on the Scrambler. It really made sense to me. The Adventure, on the other hand, is for somebody who's looking for, well, a tall upright motorcycle, somebody who's looking to do maybe long distances on the highways, but be able to take on some really heavy off-road trails as well. So there's a little bit here for everybody in terms of their prices. This starts at just under 2 lakh rupees. They go up to little over 2 lakh rupees, so 2.1 lakh for the Adventure. And I think that makes them really good value, particularly the Scrambler and the Adventure. They give you a lot. That Scrambler, it's the only bona fide Scrambler in the segment. There's nothing like it. You've got the Husqvarna Svartpilen, but that's not a proper Scrambler. That's essentially a sport bike which looks like a Scrambler. This, the Yezdi Scrambler, is a bona fide Scrambler with proper long travel suspension, with an engine tune that complements its chassis. And I think that makes the most sense of the three. I think it also looks the coolest. This one here, well, it's a nice bike, but you've also got a lot of competition to it. You've got the 350s from Royal Enfield, from Honda, from Java, there's so many bikes around that are trying to do and fit into the space that this Yezdi is trying to fit into, and therefore it has a lot more competition. The Adventure, obviously, its most direct rival is the Himalayan, and like I said earlier, I think the Himalayan is just a little more polished in that sense. But it is good value that Yezdi is offering with the Scrambler Adventure. Which one is your pick? Let us know down in the comments below.